Well, there we are. Totty's slate, or Totty-style slate anyway, in the 40s. Now look, I'm rugged up today because I'm freezing. I don't know what the temperature is, but it must be about -10, that's for sure. Now, I should be doing something else. I should be dealing with this, why was Charleville flooded? Why has Charleville been flooded all of these years? How did it begin? What was the story? But it's a bit complicated, and oh dear. You know, my old addled brain, just trying to put it into some comprehensible form. I'm just letting it settle on my mind just for the moment. So I've decided to do another part of my plan. This is the plan for posterity, I might add. I'm going to describe Charleville in the 40s, 1940s. But in many episodes, many episodes, I would have thought, that's if I'm spared. If I'm spared, I will continue. But anyway, I've done one in which I began with the sort of do's and don'ts of Charleville in the 1940s. But I thought I'd be a bit more systematic, and I'd start today with the business of what I call Lower King Street. I could have called it King Street Heights if there had been a height, but Lower King Street in the 40s, that means our end of town down towards the end of Cumbernauld Road, from about West Street down. And I thought I'd describe that for the historical record and for posterity, of course, because, you know, eventually in 2122 a researcher will find this, you see, and say, oh, isn't this wonderful? Okay, well, I'll just make my way through it. Not in any... I'll be structured insofar as the streets were structured and as the houses were structured, and we'll leave it at that, and God only knows what will come of it, you know, barring defamation or whatever it may be. I was born in 1938, and we lived near what, I don't know what you call it in town these days, but the Big Tree. Or it had another name. We called it always the Big Tree. But sometimes we called it Gordon's Big Tree, and the reason that it was called Gordon's Big Tree was because that's where the Gordons lived, near there. The Gordons built a small house on the left-hand side of the road. That would be the even-numbered side of the road, you know, in today's fancy parlance. I don't know when they built that place. They probably built it in the 30s, I would have thought. I can't remember how many rooms it had. I think it had 3 rooms, a veranda all around. There was a bathroom on the northeast corner, verandas all around, 3 rooms other than that, a sort of, you know, a living room, dining room, which was not really used. And then there was a sort of kitchen behind it. And then there must have been a couple of bedrooms beyond that, I think. But anyway, the thing was, times were tough, and old Alex and Sarah had paid for, or somehow or another, built this house. But by 1938, they were unable to keep up the payments on it. Well, that's the story in our house anyway. And so when my mother and father were married, under hasty circumstances, I might add, but that was the fashion in those days, my father rented this house from the Gordons, and that's where I spent my first 4 years. And so I was living there in the shade of the Big Tree. And we moved from there just before my 4th birthday, because I can remember just before Christmas in 1940, what would that be, 42, 8 and 4, in 4 and 42, no, Christmas 41. My father took a fig tree cutting in a sugar bag up to the new house, and he planted it there in the corner, never pruned it, and it turned into a gigantic thing, you know, covered half an acre almost, I think. And but those first 4 years, so we lived there in what we call Gordon's house. But it was Gordon's house, but okay. So there was us, of no particular interest. But the street itself had all sorts of interest, you know. We had, in those days, everyone had chooks, and we used to have some chooks running in the backyard. And so the people behind us were the Creevies. And Mrs. Creevy, I can't remember Mrs. Creevy as a person. She had 2 children, I think. One was called Sister Creevy, or we called her Sister Creevy anyway, and her son was Stevie Creevy. But of Stevie Creevy and Sister Creevy I can tell you nothing much, but I can tell you about the chooks. Now, I told you that my father was a bit light-fingered, you know. Many of the Bilberys were a bit light-fingered. Well, they would deny it, and they were never found guilty in court, that's for sure. And on the occasion when one uncle was found with a dead sheep and a rifle in the back boot of his car, he expressed considerable surprise about it. An enemy hath done this, I'm sure he said. But anyway, Mrs. Creevy was that house was well established too. It was a high house. I think they had a lot of fruit trees in the yard, and they had the chook yard down the back. And my father's a bit light-fingered, and he somehow or another, well, maybe the chook got through the fence or something, but one of Mrs. Creevy's chooks got through the fence. One of those black chooks, I don't know what they call them. I used to know, but you know, the old head goes. Anyway, the big black chooks, all very stately madams they were. Anyway, one of these chooks got into our yard. Well, my father thought it was a good idea to purloin it, you know, nine possession is 9 points to law. Now, Mrs. Creevy knew all of her chooks, possibly even by name. Well, this posed a problem for my father. Now, in those days, of course, you know, there were no electric stoves or anything like that. We used to have a wooden stove upstairs. Everyone had a wooden stove. But every now and then, you know, you'd decide you'd tart your stove up. You know, these stoves were black, greasy-looking things. Crown, I think the brand was, if I remember rightly. And so when you'd tart your stove up, you would paint it with silver frost. Whether it's a kind of paint, I don't know whether it's still sold or not, but anyway, so it was like a paint that was silvery in colour. Well, here was my father with Mrs. Creevy's black chalk. So my father painted the chalk with silver frost and turned it into a silver frosted chalk. Now that chalk lasted a long, long time. We used to call old Blackie. Now Mrs. Creevy knew that she was missing a chalk, and she also knew that the chalk was black. Well, she used to cast a suspicious eye over a yard, and a bilby yard too, of course, which, you know, would have caused... There was a reason for additional suspicion, shall we say. Anyway, she saw this silver chook, and she used to express to my mother and father some surprise about this breed of chook. She had never seen such a chook before, this silver chook. But anyway, it was her chook. And so the chook joined our yard. So in our yard we had chooks, and there were some grapes between our place and where Gordons went to live. But I don't know that they had produced anything very much, and but you know, the chooks used to wander the yard. That particular house, it had its dangers, you know, because all in front of it had that very basic bougainvillea, you know, that deep purple bougainvillea with 6-inch thorns. It was never watered, of course, but bougainvillea can live anywhere, it seems. And anyway, the damn thorns would fall off on the ground, and of course we'd be wandering around, kids of 3 and 4, whatever it may be, well, certainly for me 3. But oh God, you'd walk along and you'd get a thorn in your foot, and it was really painful. If I disliked anything about that house, it was those thorns. And but anyway, the Gordons had to move into a little hut next door. Now that was a little further south. So there was our place, Gordon's house, and then there was a yard with some grapevines in it. Then they ultimately built a horse breaking yard right in front on King Street. And then beside that they had a little hut. I think it only had, you know those sort of 19th century huts on the ground floor. There was a sort of a kitchen eating area, a kind of room at the back, and then there was, I don't know, it might have been a large, I never ventured into it. Might have been another large bedroom, and there was a bit of a veranda in front. And in front they really had, all the front was covered in that lovely purple morning glory. And that's where Alex and Sarah and Kate was there at that time. Yes, Kate would have been there. And they had a stepson or something like that called Alan Kelly. Oh, yes, he must have been related because Mrs. Gordon was a Kelly. Okay, then. And then they had an area at the back, and they disgraced themselves in about 1935 with the council because they had persisted with a pit toilet. Well, we'll call it a toilet anyway. But anyway, the council was insistent. Now, whether they ever did anything about it or not, I can't remember thunderbox down the back of that yard. But nevertheless, old Alex, I don't know what Alex had been. Alex had been he may have been a drover. He probably was a drover, I would have thought, and he's more sprightly. He's a tall, lean sort of man. But we didn't really know very much about Alex. But we did know plenty about Sarah, because Sarah was a very wonderful woman. Sarah couldn't read or write, and so if a letter would come when we were a bit older, we'd say, Mrs. Gordon, there's a letter for you, and she'd say, oh, would you read it to me? And so we'd read the letter to her. Probably a bill, I would have thought. And but Sarah was a wonderful woman. She must have, as I mentioned, had glaucoma, and her eyesight was very bad. And she never saw the flies, I can tell you. And she used to cook these brownies, and the brownies would be swarming with flies. Well, that didn't trouble Sarah, or Alex for that matter. And anyway, nor did it trouble us, because the brownies were pretty good despite the flies. But Sarah was the daughter of Rager Kelly. Now, the Bealbys and the Kellys were long-time friends, because the older generation, the generation above my grandfather, and my grandfather himself in his youth, they used to live just over the river at Gowrie Crossing. We'd go across Gowrie Crossing, turn to the right, and then there was some houses along there. And I know the Kellys lived there, Roger Kelly lived there, the Bealbys lived there, that was old John Bealby, lived there. And who else? Maybe the Robinsons, I would have thought, but I went over there once with my father in about the 1970s or 80s, and you could still see some of the signs of what had been habitation, from the old crushed sardine cans that apparently my great-grandmother used to like. But anyway, Sarah was there, and it was sort of a droving family. There were 3 children in that family. There was Annie. Annie married a fellow called Ronnie Eames, who used to serve the council a bit from time to time, especially about the time when they finally came to a decision to build a new swimming pool in King Edward Park. And they used to have some fairly lively council debates on this matter. That debate went on and on and on. And Ronnie Eames was able to require them at some stage, possibly by threat, I don't really know. But anyway, they eventually made a decision. But anyway, the elder daughter was Annie, and Annie married Ronnie Eames. Then there were 2 sons. There was Barney and there was Paddy. And now Barney and Paddy used to be involved in droving, I think, or perhaps they worked on stations at other times. But I do recall in round about the, something like that, 46, 47. But the last droving trip that I ever heard of in that area, of course droving no doubt went on with other people, but Barney set off on a great droving trip, and he was heading south as far as I can tell. But it was a droving family, and they had all the droving kit and equipment and all that sort of thing, and this was the days before you moved sheep or cattle or whatever by truck, and that's what Barney did. Paddy, I think, may have done much the same sort of thing. Paddy married Dorothy Whitney. Mrs. Whitney had been for many years the matron of the hostel, and but I think they sort of moved out west, into the distant part of this, kind of the Warwick area, Barcoo area, whatever it may have been. But anyway, that was the Gordon family. But they're very much a horsey family, and a horsey in relation to droving, or horsey in relation to... They had a friend called Nugget Smith later on in the piece. I'm not quite sure oh, let me think, I had 10 years, so about 48, 49, something like that. Nugget Smith was a horse trainer, short man, short fellow, squat sort of fellow. He didn't take a liking to me, I didn't take a liking to him either. Our values were different, I think. But he used to be involved in training racehorses, but it was a good thing because, you know, races in those days in Charleville, well, it wasn't a matter of, the winner was not entirely a matter of skill, you know, because Nugget always knew when a horse was, I think what was the term, it was going, yes. Now, if a horse, so he would have a horse, but he could advise you that it wasn't, I think the term was going, therefore don't bother putting your money on it. But every now and then you'd hear that a horse was going, and when the horse was going, put your money on it because it would probably win. Okay, so they were the Gordons. Wonderful family, wonderful family. Then, okay, beside them, that's when they were in the little hut. Then when we moved up into our house, which was a bit further up the road on the right-hand side, on the odd number side, on a block that belonged to Frank Conley, then the Gordons moved back into their house, and that's where they lived, and that's where Sarah cooked the brownies. And of course she cooked other things too, and it was reputed, I can't say that I observed this, but I do know that the family used to tell the story often enough. I think these fellows, well, Alex and probably a few of the others, you know, used to like a little drop of rum every now and then. And I don't know whether it was a Christmas dinner or whether it was just an ordinary Sunday dinner, but the men folk at that time were not really keen on chopping the wood, and so Sarah stuffed into the wood stove a log, and she kept moving it forward into the burning area of the stove on the end of a chair because there was no small pieces. But Sarah, you know, she had a sort of whiny sort of voice, I remember, and you know, sort of nasalized, and I don't know whether it was a Christmas dinner or just a Sunday dinner, but she cooked and she slaved in the middle of summer. Oh dear, what a slavery it was. Dinner was probably ready around about 1 or 1:30 or something like that. And when she called for dinner, she'd cook all the stuff that you cook for a Sunday dinner, you know, those of you who can recall that time when we really cooked and baked Sunday dinners, you know, with roast potatoes and pumpkin and God only knows what not, and probably, you know, a bit of stolen sheep and probably a wild duck shot down the 2 mile. They were all too drunk to eat it. So Sarah had gone to all of this trouble, and they were all too drunk to eat it. But anyway, that was the way of things in those days, and, you know, we talked about it, of course, but, you know, we didn't find it particularly shocking or unusual or anything like that. It was just one of those things that you noted. Now, beside the next house along there was an unusual sort of house. It was a high house. And if you looked at it from the front, when I say a high house, it had 2 floors. There was a ground floor, you know, not on stilts. It was, you know, all sort of habitation under there. Then there was a higher part, the second floor, anyway, you know, 2 levels. And that were the Hayes'. Now, I don't know that I don't recall Mr. Hayes or Mrs. Hayes, but there were 2 boys in the family. One was called Rennie Hayes. And the other boy was called Tommy Hayes. They were older than me. Rennie was the older one, and Tommy was the younger one, but he was probably about 10 years older than I was, I would have thought, or nearly 10 years older. We didn't know very much about them, but what we did know was that certainly Rennie, and I don't know about Tommy. Oh no, Rennie, the older one. Rennie, we used to do some study, and so he was sort of academically inclined. What happened to Rennie, I really do not know. Tommy, I don't know. Tommy used to be a friend of my uncle, my father's younger brother. They went off to New Zealand at one stage, where my uncle Kevin remained. What happened to Tommy, I don't really know. But they were in a sort of an academic family, and they weren't a horsey family, and so we really didn't have very much to do with them, other than I didn't have much to do with them. Okay, then beside that there was a little cottage. Now, at the point where King Street ends, it then joins up with, at an angle, the old Cunnamulla Road. And there used to be a little place there called, owned by a family called Pettifords. Now, the Pettifords we really didn't know a great deal about. It was a family with a lot of daughters, as I recall. They were older, I can't remember. They certainly, some years older than I was. But I recall it was a family. Now, the Pettifords was a family that, as I say, we really didn't know too much about. But I do notice in the newspapers of the 19th century, Mr. Pettiford, who may have been a drover, I'm not quite sure, but I have seen the name Pettiford in the 19th century papers. And then after that, there was nothing much, because the angle went down that way, and there were no more houses until you got down to the corner, of that block, which was sort of, like a knife sort of thing. Okay, now that's on one side of the street, and starting with where we began, under the big tree. Now, that big tree, we could never climb. It was beyond climbing. Now, my father told me that, I used to say to him, how old do you think that tree is? And he really didn't know. But he said that as we used to see it, at any point in my existence, either now or when I was young, it always seems to be the same size to me now as it used to be. But my father said that it was the same size when he was young, and that was, in the 1920. He was born in 1915, but he says the tree seemed the same size then as it seems now. So the age of the tree I really do not know, but how quickly those carbine trees grow I don't know. But there are some of them grow over there in the golf links, towards the end of the first fairway, maybe the second fairway. And a number of them used to be there, but they were fairly young, and I've often thought, next time I'm in Charleville, I'll go out and have a look at the size of those trees, because I can remember how big they were, 70, 75 years ago, whatever it may have been. And it'd be interesting to see how much they've grown in that time. That's if they're still there, of course. Okay, so I've dealt with that side of the street. Well, I better go up a little bit further, because we were in Gordon's house, but if you went up through several blocks, we'll call them residential blocks, until you got to the corner of King Street and, what was that street? May Street. Yeah, May Street. On that corner, that's where my grandfather and grandmother lived. I don't know when they moved there. Maybe they moved there sometime in the 20s, perhaps. I'm not sure. The house came to grief recently, as you may know. It was burnt, and so it will just be a shell there. But it was Beelby Hall, the ancestral hall. My grandfather and grandmother, they brought up 11 children, either there or certainly they had 11 children. Well, it wasn't really a big house. It was a high house, and so there were plenty of beds underneath. But that was good, because, it was cool in the summer, and that was not a bad thing. And then upstairs it had a veranda in front, veranda in the back. They eventually put a bathroom on the veranda at the back, because they used to have a shower underneath the tank stand at the back, downstairs. And then there was a kitchen, there was a living room, and then there were 2 bedrooms. And thank God, plenty of verandas, I would think, but somehow or another. But of course, the family was spread over so many years that the first time that all the surviving children were together, and it seems strange, but nevertheless, the first time all of the surviving children were together was at my grandmother's funeral. Okay, then. And so the eldest and the youngest were together with the ones in the middle for the first time then. And so that's how father, because they had begun their career over the river at Gowrie Crossing. Okay, then. So that was on that side of the street. On the other side of the street, there was nothing much there in those early years. It was our house and a few spare blocks. And then directly opposite my grandfather's place, my uncle Jack, he and his wife Gladys, and our cousin Don, with whom we spent most of our time fighting, lived there. Uncle Jack had, chooks, of course, many fruit trees, of which we never saw even so much as a small mandarin. He also had, and he was about the only one who had grapevines there that actually produced grapes. I did actually see them, but I never actually tasted them. Oh dear. Yes. We envied them, of course, but there we were. Okay then. And then beside that, there used to be the place there of Jackie Fagan. Jackie Fagan had two sort of huts. There was a little sort of cottage there, not quite directly opposite Gordon's house, but almost within the shade of the big tree. And that belonged to Jackie Fagan, but in my earliest days, when we were living in Gordon's house, my aunt, my father's sister, Lil, and her debonair husband, Jim Baldwin, they used to live there. And it was no flash place, and I can't even remember what it was like inside, because they had a bed out on the veranda, and I would go over there when I was 2 or 3 and sing, apparently. Well, yes, I do remember singing. Little Sir Echo, how do you do? That was one thing, but I was a fairly precocious child, of course, so, and I was the only child at that point, and so what between my mother and father and Uncle Jim and Auntie Lil, they looked after me fairly well, but they encouraged my precocious ways, shall we say. But behind there was a hut on the a little hut on the Cunnamulla Road, and now Jackie Fagan. Now Uncle Jim's mother, I think it was. I think she was Mrs. Fagan. They lived there, and I can't remember Jackie Fagan, but obviously Jackie Fagan was there. But he had grapevines going all the way down to the corner of the block, because on the other side of the big tree, on the other part of the shadow of the big tree, in the morning, you came to that corner where that part of King Street met the old Cunnamulla Road. And Jackie Fagan used to have grapes there. But by the time I can remember the grapevines, they had, we'll say, past their peak. And we never got anything from them either. My grandfather had grapes, we got nothing from there. The Gordons had grapes, we got nothing from there. Jackie Fagan had grapes, we got nothing from there. My uncle had grapes and we got nothing from there. They actually grew. So there we are. So they were the people who lived there. Now eventually Nellie Lahane came to live there in a house next door. It seemed to us a big house at the time, but it apparently is a much smaller house than we see it now. And those empty blocks that were there, I think they've all been filled up by this. Okay then. So I go over to the even side of the street now, and in the 40s, of course, the house almost opposite us belonged to the Turveys. There was Bill Turvey, who never worked in his life apparently, and Elsie, an uncomplaining little woman in a long dress down to her ankles. And poor Elsie used to do all the work, and Bill used to just, I think he used to go up to he went to one of the Newtown hotels. I don't know whether he was an habitué of Bell's Hotel or an habitué of Tat's Hotel, but it was one or the other. But they used to have a garden in front. And but I don't know about Bill. Bill, we always thought was a bit of a no-hoper, or lazy no-hoper. But I don't know he was totally no-hoper. It's just that he didn't take to work very much. And anyway, but they used to have a garden in front, and they used to grow vegetables there. Although it was all pure sand, I don't know how they fertilised it. But Mrs. Turvey, Elsie, used to also grow some flowers. And every now and then, I don't know, as a matter of wild extravagance, or perhaps maybe to give Mrs. Turvey a bit of a hand, I don't really know, but more likely a moment of wild extravagance. So, my mother would send us over with a shilling and ask Mrs. Turvey if she would cut us a shilling's worth of flowers. And so whether it was to assist the Turveys or not, I don't know, or whether it was just, as I say, wild extravagance. But I always feel sorry for Elsie, and I suppose I feel sorry for Bill Turnaway, as I feel sorry for so many of those people. They eventually got over to the cemetery, and there they were promptly forgotten. And so Elsie will be over there somewhere, Bill will be over there somewhere, totally forgotten. But she's not totally forgotten, because I've got a photo over here. I don't know how I ended up with it, but I've got a photo over here, and I think, well, look, while ever I have that photo, while Elsie may be forgotten at the cemetery, she's certainly not forgotten by me, and she's not forgotten while ever that photo exists. Well, that was our King Street. Okay. Well, I'll range a little bit beyond King Street. Now, I did range a little bit beyond King Street when I told you about the silver-frosted chook and Mrs. Creevy. Now, I don't know about Sister Creevy and Stevie Creevy. They must. I think they might have gone on to whatever might have been the form of the high school in those days. But as far as I know, the Creevys were not horsey people. But if you wanted horsey people, well, you went to the house. I think that street behind there is called Carter Street, and on the corner of May Street and Carter Street, and behind my grandmother's place, is the Hasted's place. Now, Mrs. Hasted was a Britcher, and they were a fairly substantial family in the 19th century at least, and possibly in the early 20th century. I don't know what the dates were, but they were horsey people, and exactly what they did to their horses I don't know, but they had horses, that's for sure. Now let me think. There was Henry, there was Kevin, and Kevin, let me think. There were two others. One boy had a spastic child, was in a wheelchair, whose name escapes me just for the moment. Henry was killed in a riding accident. The horse one way, he went one way, the horse went another way, and there was a tree in the middle, and that was not good. But he was the eldest of them. And there was Kevin. Kevin, I think, became an ambulance man in town. Whether he's still there, and they built a house there on the corner eventually. Then if you went down that street, there's still blocks, and then if you went down towards Cunnamulla Road from, of course, Mrs. Hasted, did the dirty on us once. My father, I think I may have mentioned this, my father, well, they didn't always follow the rules, and my father espied at one stage, beside fairway number 1 on the golf course, a box tree containing a beehive. So he went over at dusk one day when he thought he would not be observed, and he cut the box tree down and fell across the number 1 fairway. And he, of course, removed the beehive. And we probably dined well on the honey for some time. Of course, a few days later, an apoplectic Dr. Fox arrived, accusing my father of having cut a box tree down across the number 1 fairway. Naturally, of course, he denied all knowledge of it. And in more apoplexy, Dr. Fox retreated. He was the president or something of the golf club. But Lou Hasted had espied him in the act through her louvers. She had louvers made of fibro, I think. There was not glass, but fibro. And Lou espied him and reported him. But anyway, we had the honey, so there we are. But we always were very friendly to Mrs. That's the kids. We were always very friendly to Mrs. Hasted, because Mrs. Hasted had a cart. And the Hasteds in those years, in the 40s, had the butcher shop up there near Ianson's. Ianson's shop on the corner there in what they call Newtown, just down the road from the Bells Hotel. Well, Mrs. Hasted had a cart, and she would take the cart each morning to the butcher shop. And there'd be a horse, and there'd be Mrs. Hasted with the reins. David, that was the boy with the spasticity. And David, and Roy was the other one. Yes, Roy, about the age of my uncle. He was the same age as my uncle Kevin and Tommy Hayes. Anyway, Roy was the younger one, David was the youngest, I think. But anyway, Lou had a cart. And Lou would drive that cart up King Street, all the way up King Street until she got up there to near the butcher shop. And every now and then our leaving for school would coincide with Mrs. Hastings passing by. Well, oh, were we smarmy. Oh, hello, Mrs. Hastings. Hello, Mrs. Hastings. Can we have a ride in your cart to school? Well, Mrs. Hastings always accommodated us, and we'd climb up on the wheels, and in the back of the cart we'd get, and it was as if we were riding in a Rolls Royce. And certainly I sat in the cart on the horse, you know, farting and doing a bit of a poop every now and then, as horses do, you know. Those of you who are not horsey people won't understand these things, but, you know, those things happen. And, I'd sit there, you know, like Jackie, I can tell you, and I would, you know, look down, I can tell you, on mere pedestrians making their way to school. But it was a good idea to keep on side of Mrs. Hastings while ever she had that cart. Not that we spoke well of her other than that, though, but there we are. I think we never forgave her for snitching on my father for cutting the. If you go to the golf links now, you know, on that left-hand side of the number 1 fairway, you can still see in the middle of it a truncated box tree. That was the tree. Well, you move on a little bit down the road beyond where are we up to? Mrs. Creevy. There was another house there. I don't know whether the Davidsons may have been there. And I couldn't swear to this. But there was a horsey family there. And they used to have horses. I think they were racehorse people also, as I recall. They may have been the Davidsons. I can't swear to that one. Of course, you know, my father used to go out early in the year, maybe, I don't know. When do pigs have litters? March, April or something like that. And if my father saw a pig on the riverbank somewhere with a litter, he'd always get a pig, a wild pig, and he'd bring it in. Oh, and we'd bring this pig up, the most wonderful pig. The pigs are very intelligent creatures, you know. And maybe it became a great pet. Of course, that did it no good when Christmas time came, because we ate it with gusto, I can tell you. But our pig used to disgrace itself because it knew where all the horsey people were, because horsey people had feed for their horses. And the pig knew it. And the pig used to go around, of course. When the pig would come to grief at Christmas, you could see all these whip marks. Whip marks across the back. Anyway, a little bit down the road from we'll say it's Davidson's, the horsey people, whoever, anyway. There was another little cottage right down on the corner there, near where that Carter Street meets the Cunnamulla Road. And that was where Buller Green lived. Now, the Buller Green seemed to have a lot of children. Now, Buller was not reputed to work regularly, I think. Buller probably met up with Bill Turvey from time to time, I would have thought. But Mrs. Green was a fairly sturdy sort of woman. And I can remember in the 40s, she was a bigwig with the 4VL Women's Club. Mrs. Green was the generator of energy at the 4VL Club. Okay then. So they were the Greens. Buller, as I say, Buller was reputed, now this may be false, and this may be the sort of talk that went on in our house, and remember, we were not the cream of the cream, and we had all the low talk. Buller was not reputed to be fond of work, but anyway, no matter. But there was one really interesting family there that to this day I regret not knowing better. But there was a family on the corner of May and Carter Streets, opposite Lou Hastings' place, called the Lewises. Now this was a really interesting family, and to my dying day, whenever that may be, I will have this regret that I didn't do something that I should have done, which I will tell. Now, Mrs. Lewis must have been a Bailey. I can't remember a Mr. Lewis, but there were 3 Lewis children, as I recall, and they were all really talented people. There was Bernie Lewis. Bernie used to be a part-time announcer on 4VL. Okay, the Bernie, and then what was the Patty Lewis? I think. I can't remember what Paddy did, but they were clever. It was and then the younger one was Lenny. Lenny was about our age, but they were a talented family. The house was not a comfortable one. It was built of, very narrow ripple, brown corrugated iron, very hot. But they were not flush with funds. But boy, it was a talented family, I can tell you. But where is my regret? My regret is this one. Oh, Lenny used to come over to our place from time to time, and we would have writing competitions. This is when I was about 10 or 8 or 10 or something like that. But Lenny was good. Lenny had a good imagination, and Lenny and I would sit down and we'd write stories. And, well, we did write our main story. A pity it wasn't kept, Our main story was a story called The Saga of Lou. Well, I was going to say the heroine of the story was Lou Hasted, but she wasn't exactly a heroine. It was The Adventures of Lou. Shall we say, our imaginations ran wild, and if Lou would have skinned us had she known what we wrote. But the stories that we told had nothing to do with anything other than our fevered imagination. However, over the road were the Lewises. Now, as I tell you, those Lewis kids were bright. They were good. Patsy and I think it was Patsy, pretty sure it was Patsy, and Bernie, they were really good, really, really talented people. I'd love to know what happened to them. But the interesting thing, behind where the Lewises lived, there was a hut covered almost entirely in, we'll call it a hut, not unlike the old pensioners' hut over on the sandhill, really, covered in morning glory. And in that hut lived Mrs. Lewis's mother. Now, Mrs. Lewis's mother was old Mrs. Bailey. Now, old Mrs. Bailey would have been, I suppose, about a half-blood Aboriginal person, I think. She was a tallish woman, fairly, strong sort of woman. Not fat, but, tall, well-boned. And used to wear very long dresses, again down to her ankle. She had a bit of a limp, probably from a burn, I would have thought, if I were to have a guess about it. But we were frightened of her, because we didn't know very much about Aboriginal people at that time, and certainly in that area of town. And we were afraid of Mrs. Lewis, or Mrs. Bailey rather. We would see her walking up to the, her long dresses up to the shops and so on, but we never spoke to her. Lenny might go from time to time, and we might sort of go near there. But anyway, in all of my time there, I never spoke to Mrs. Bailey. But anyway, when I was a bit older and a bit more sensible, I thought, gee, I'd love to talk to Mrs. Bailey. And so I went out to Charleville and thought, look, the first thing I'm going to do is go to Mrs. Bailey's place and talk to her, because she must have a million stories to tell. But by the time I got there, of course, she had died, and so all the stories went with her, which was a terrible thing, and I regret that to my day. She had a son called Billy Bailey, and Billy used to be a woodcutter, and he'd cut wood for people, and I think he also cut wood for the powerhouse. And Billy would go, mainly boxwood he'd bring into town, and he always had a truck, but he never drove the truck in anything other than first gear. And so he travelled fairly slowly in that truck. And as he would buy each new truck, the old truck would lay abandoned in the yard. So there were a number of them sitting around there. But Billy, I don't even know that I ever spoke to Billy. But, in those days, I think the attitudes were different. And the fact that we should be afraid to talk to Mrs. Bailey was no great credit to us, I can assure you. And I don't know that anyone there actually, I can't remember my grandmother visiting Mrs. Bailey. I can't remember Sarah Gordon visiting Mrs. Bailey, but, that's how it was. So there we are. So other than that, though, no, I've dealt with King Street. Now, behind King Street, of course, in the street beyond there, behind us, there was a tall house, had been there for a long time. And, well, there were many families. The Dorsteins lived there. Had a taxi service, as I recall. The Prides lived there. a fairly arty sort of family, as I recall. And then came the scourge, the Taylors. Oh, God! And I'll tell you why. There were 3 daughters. There was Nita, who married, I don't know whether she married or worked in Austin's shoe shop. Can't be sure about that one. But then there were 2 daughters. There was Deirdre and Yvonne. Now, they were about our age. And they were nice girls. And I think Nita or Nina, I can't remember, was the older one. But they had cedar trees. Well, that bloody Yvonne and Deirdre, they couldn't climb up into the cedar trees and cut those. As you know, we had to cut the cedars. You had to cut all the branches off all the cedar trees every year at the end of autumn. And then you'd throw the stuff over into Frank Conley's yard, and you'd have a dirty big bundle of cedar limbs that made very good burning for Guy Fawkes night in November. But we had to get over that damn fence, and I don't know how many cedar trees they had. Our father never had a sharp saw, and my brother and I would climb up into those bloody cedar trees, and we'd have to cut them and drag the leaves. Oh, how we hated it. My mother would say, "You still haven't finished cutting all of Mrs. Taylor's leaves, cutting all of Mrs. Taylor's cedar trees." Oh, I bore a grudge for many years, I can tell you. They were behind there. But the rest of the up to the end of, up there, the empty blocks, Frank Conley, that's Toddy's brother, he owned half an acre there. And actually the block of land that our house was built on was bought from Frank Conley. Frank, in the 30s, must have had, or early 40s, perhaps, I don't really know. No, it may have been early 40s. He still had chooks and ducks and geese and that sort of thing there. But then he stopped, and we used to climb over the fence. And he still had one mandarin tree there, which we'd raid from time to time. But he had a number of huts there, and I know in one of them there was an incubator. And we always just think, well, what a pity it wasn't used. But there it was, because from an experimental point of view, it would have been a damn good thing. But what is now the irrigation department, and it's 2 blocks, up there on West Street, or on either side of King Street, they were just bare blocks with a track going through them with galvanised burr on either side. Oh, dear. Galvanised iron burr. Oh, dear. Oh, galvanised burr, not galvanised iron burr, galvanised burr. So that was it. So you had those empty blocks, you had Turveys, and then you moved down to my grandmother's, and then you moved down to the Gordons, and then you'd move down to probably still the Pettifords and so on. And then you had the people over there near the Lewises. There were the Pattersons were next door. Then after that was the Fishers. Then there were the empty blocks and so on. And then everything down to the gully then was sort of quite open. So there we are. But that's where we spend nearly all our time. And so that area of town in the 40s was a horsey area. But in terms of activity, in addition to the horses, there were unproductive grapevines. But there were a number of families where there was some scholarly work going on there, certainly with the Creevies and with the Hayes families. But that was about it. And that's where we spent our time, under that big tree and wandering up and down and going in and getting a brownie for Mrs. Gordon, hoping our uncle would give us a grape, but he never did. Buying shillings worth of flowers from old Mrs. Turvey and cutting those bloody cedar trees for the Taylors. Oh, I wish those girls had learnt more. They were lovely girls who went to the convent and all that sort of thing, but and then their sister was rather older than them, and their sister used to have to discipline them from time to time, as I recall. But oh dear, I remember those cedar trees. Of course, we had our own cedar trees, but not as many as the Taylors had, I can tell you. So there we are. That was King Street in the 40s.